Good day, class. Let's go ahead and talk about evidence of evolution. Now, if you guys remember, evolution is a theory, and when we talk about theories in science, that's going to be slightly different than when we talk about theories in regular daily life. When we talk about theories in regular daily life, it might sound like a best guess, or you think that's going to happen. But when we're talking about theories in science, a theory is something that's heavily supported by evidence. So all throughout today, we're going to talk about the evidence of evolution. Now, I have this funny image of Homer Simpson. A lot of you guys might watch The Simpsons, right? And his possible ancestors as we go further and further back in time, okay? Now, this shows evolution kind of on a linear time scale. But when you guys are thinking about evolution, I actually want you guys to think of something more like this, which is like a tree of life. So we see here some sort of protozoan, some sort of amoeba, some sort of unicellular life, okay? Very primitive, doesn't really have a lot of organelles. But as that life evolves, we get all these different types of plants and animals and fungi, and a lot of them are going to be extinct. For example, our dinosaurs. But some of them are still going to be living, for example, horses and dragonflies and a lot of different plant life, okay? So we have started out with one common ancestor, but kind of radiated out into many different species. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is fossils. Now, when you think of fossils, you might think of Jurassic Park, which we watched right before the Thanksgiving break. Remember, they looked at these amber fossils, and from the mosquitoes, they tried to pull out some dinosaur DNA. But we all know that dinosaur DNA is non-existent because it can't stay intact for that long because those hydrogen bonds start to break, right, between all those nucleotides. But let's go ahead and get started on our notes. Okay. So again, when we're talking about evidence of evolution, first of all, I want to make sure that you guys write your name and class period and all that good stuff. Okay. All right. So we need some sort of evidence to support our evolutionary theory. And today, scientists use 4 different types, namely fossil record, biochemistry, embryology, and biogeography. We're going to talk about the first 2 types in this video, fossil records and biochemistry. Remember that evolution is this idea that changes occur in a population over time, okay? So when we look at fossil records, we're trying to look back into time and see the history, right? So when we look at all those different fossil records, we see kind of a timeline, and that's exactly what we're going to put here. So when we analyze them together and we put them in the right order, the dated sequence, we could come up with an evolutionary timeline. So that evolutionary timeline really helps us to figure out what traits came first, what organisms might have come first, right? And so scientists can date these fossils by observing which layer of rock they originate from. So if we're at the very bottom layer of rock, are we going to have old fossils or new fossils? Okay, so if we're at the very bottom, we should have older fossils. Okay, so the oldest fossils are going to be at the very bottom, while when we go up to the very top, that's going to have our newest fossils. So oldest at the bottom, newest at top. Most of you guys have probably known this for quite some time, right? Maybe even middle school or even elementary school, right? So let's go back to our PowerPoint. We have evolutionary timeline, oldest and newest. So here's kind of a neat little illustration. We have the oldest layers of rock here down at the bottom, and so that's going to have our oldest fossils. While our newest layer of rock is going to have our newest fossils. And over here on the right side, we see all the different eras and eons and different periods throughout the world, okay, throughout the history of the world. Here's a neat little illustration. Both of them are actually from evolution.berkeley.edu. Okay, this is an excellent resource. Berkeley is one of the leading universities out in California. So if you guys want to check out this website, evolution@berkeley.edu, I think it's a great resource if you guys want to study evolution. So we have here some sort of hypothetical organism. Starts out as a pentagon, right? And remember that organisms are always trying to be most adapted, most well adapted to their environment. But unfortunately, the environment keeps changing over time. So from generation to generation, the best traits, the best adaptations kind of change as well. So we see this gradual lineage evolution in which we have something very basic, very simple, and over time it starts to become more and more complex because it's trying to better fit its environment. Here is a more literal, a more concrete example in which we're looking at a killer whale. Okay, shabu. Now, if you look at the killer whale, modern day killer whales, we see that it's very well adapted for marine life. But if we go back in the evolutionary timeline and look at older and older and older fossils, we see its ancestors. Now, these ancestors might be partially well adapted for its environment, okay? We see here some fins, but no dorsal fin, okay? We see here no fins at all, but a tail, and even some hind limbs, okay? And over here we see a clearly terrestrial, a clearly land-based animal, which is a far cry from our modern day killer whales, okay? So this evolution is supported by these fossil evidences in which we see some transitory forms, okay? These transition phases. The next evidence that we're going to talk about is biochemistry. Now, bio, of course, meaning biology, and chemistry combined together. Now, if you look at this M in chemistry, you might notice that it kind of looks, and also this Y over here, it kind of looks like a DNA molecule. Now, these are some things that we've covered since the beginning of class, so I really expect you guys to know this well, right? For example, the 4 nucleotides that we always talk about are adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, okay, when we're talking about DNA. Of course, we replace thymine with uracil when we're talking about RNA. Now in DNA, we're going to have deoxyribose sugar, while in RNA, we're going to have ribose sugar. And in both, we have these phosphate groups. Okay, so that's a little bit of our structure of DNA and RNA. But biochemistry, when we're looking at these sequences in support of evidences of evolution, we're not looking at just DNA, but we're also looking at amino acids. Now, amino acids, okay, help comprise proteins. Well, DNA is made out of nucleic acids. So our nucleic acids makes DNA, while our amino acids make protein. Remember this when we used to play a little bit of baseball? We would look at the first base, whether it was uracil, cytosine, adenine, or guanine. Then we would look at our second base, which is uracil, cytosine, adenine, or guanine again. And then we'd go to third base, uracil, cytosine, adenine, and guanine, to try to figure out exactly what amino acid are we dealing with, okay? So again, just because we went over this once does not mean you guys can forget it, because we're going to go over it again in May when you guys are testing, all right? So here again is biochemistry. So let's go back to our notes and fill out the biochemistry portion of our notes. So if we're talking about biochemistry, oops, forgot to delete this from the previous recording. Okay. So thanks to advances in modern technology, it is now possible to analyze what 2 sequences are we going to talk about. Well, the first sequence, like I said, is we're going to look at our DNA sequence, okay? Those are going to be our nucleic acids. But besides nucleic acids, we could also look at amino acids, okay, which are our proteins. So when we look at our DNA and we look at our amino acid sequences, we can figure out how much of that is shared. Now remember, you and me, we share about 99.9% of our DNA. And between us and chimps, we share a little bit less, 99.7. Okay? So that means you and I are more closely related rather than chimps, right? So chimps are a little bit more distantly related, even though we're still talking about a pretty high percentage of 99.7. So when we're talking about shared sequences, or the amount of nucleotides or nitrogen bases that are shared or are in common, this suggests that we have a common ancestor. Okay, so when we're talking about common ancestry, I want you guys to think about your cousins. Okay, your cousins and you have different parents, right? But you have probably the same set of grandparents. Okay, so your common ancestor was grandma and grandpa. Okay, so that is a little bit further away than you and your sibling. You and your sibling have the exact same parents, right? So that means you have a closer common ancestor. That means you're more closely related. Two organisms that evolved from the same ancestor, well, if they evolved from the same ancestor, do you think the DNA percentage or amino acid percentage is going to be really high, that's in common, or really low? Now, if we're talking about having a very close ancestor, we expect a very high percentage, okay? So a high percentage of DNA or a high percentage of amino acid sequence that's the same kind of tells you that, hey, we expect a closer common ancestor, right? So let's go ahead and pause right here. We've talked about fossil records and biochemistry to support evidences of evolution.